Hey everyone, what's good? Welcome back. Happy New Year. Hope everyone had a good time and is resting and recovering. I really just wanted to say thank you to everyone for all the love to the channel recently. And I really wanted to get something up here just to borrow from some other content creators I've seen, maybe looking at a tier list, looking at some of the top decks, and thinking about what are going to be some of the buffs and some of the nerfs, right? Like, what decks should you be maybe giving a try now? Whether you're making your push towards the end of the season, or if you're like, I got to where I want to be. I just want to play some stuff that's fun. I want to look at some decks that I haven't been playing. But I would be remiss if we didn't start with, at least some of the quote higher tier decks. And I think honestly, as we go through each planeswalker, this might be a bit of a longer video. I'd love to just kind of like talk about some of the builds that I've seen for pretty much each planeswalker and just kind of think about, all right, well, if this gets a bump here, if this gets a nerf here, maybe there's some potential for my favorite planeswalker. So hopefully there's something for everyone in this video, and feel free to like and comment and subscribe, and just appreciate all the support so far. So I would be remiss if I didn't start with our boy Domri. As you saw in that last video I posted, I love this deck. I just feel like this is a deck that I've really been having a lot of fun with, and just have enjoyed the level of consistency that the deck sort of brings. It kind of edged out Ral for me in that way, because Ral can sometimes have these kind of strange play patterns. I still think the deck is incredibly powerful. That's why we're going to start with kind of the S tier decks here, and we'll go over to our handy dandy little tier list creator here in a second. But Domri, right? Haven't changed too much. I will say Treetop Lookout, much bigger fan of this card after having played enough Teferi and Liliana matchups. Now Liliana's running some of those cheap black creature traps, to compete in the early game. It just feels so good when you're playing into Teferi, which I think is an incredibly powerful deck, and really good for the meta right now. To be able to have 10 mana and just go Treetop Lookout, disarm all your traps, play my Crater Hoof Behemoth, right? Or my Lava Wave or my Overrun. It just means that you have the ability to win that matchup more than you would have previously. And I think other than that, as a teammate, Beyond Bounds was saying, for any of you who know him, shout out to him. He's like they're like the Domri person. They were right, about the builds. I think you do need the Treetop Lookouts to help your worse matchups, and you're just really consistent against the field, in general. That's how I still feel. So I think Domri, will he get a nerf? Will he get a nerf or a buff? Don't think he needs a buff. He's plenty good. The nerf, I'm trying to think about the most crazy thing, and I think the best lines you have on Domri is you can play an 8-drop on turn 5, right? I think that's a combination of like Birds of Paradise and Gatstaff Agitators, right? So I guess maybe you could nerf Agitators. Maybe it's like, you get an no, I guess if you even got an empty mana gem, that would probably be a buff on the other side. I don't know. Maybe Gatstaff is a little too kind of accelerating for the deck. I mean, I would say if you were going to nerf Domri, make these cost more. Like maybe 9 mana for Lava Wave, Overrun, or Crater Hoof. That way you're not seeing them on turn 5. You would see them on turn 6 at the fastest. And also, even with Gaia's Cradle, let's say you're able to like wipe their board or trade with their creatures on turn 6. On turn 7, who knows? They might not. Maybe they've got one creature and they only have 8 mana instead of 9, right? So I think if you were going to nerf anything about the deck, you could make these 8 drops cost 1 more, and that could be reasonable. But I don't think that Domri is overpowered. I think many decks have game into it. I think its worst matchups, as I said in the video, were Teferi and Liliana, which are two very viable planeswalkers to be playing. So I think they really check Domri in terms of its power level. So I want to keep things rolling. Let's get over to Ral. As y'all know, in some of my other videos, big Rel fan, was using this to climb, when I first hit Mythic on the season. This is the build that I landed on. I was pretty down on Young Pyromancer initially when the meta felt like pretty fast, but I think now that things have kind of evened out, we're more in like a mid-range meta, in my opinion. So I think Pyromancer is way more impactful than Delver, although Delver is still the best thing that you can be doing on turn one proactively. It just doesn't do enough. Young Pyromancer is just doing so much. It turns potential losses into potential wins. That's how I feel about Rooftop Laboratory. I think it was that game against, Mon Man in my last video. They had a Rooftop Laboratory when they're at like 1 or 2 health that like allowed them to stabilize that turn. I don't think any other land really would have allowed you to do that. So, still think that Laboratory is probably the best land, for really edging out some of those really low percentage chances to win, and bumping that up a couple percentage points. And I think Rel has kind of been talked about the most as the kind of boogeyman of the format. It is still explosive. It's still a deck that can have these really, really crazy turns. But I do think, and I wrote the article on this, there are plenty of ways to interact with it, and that's what was missing about Laboratory Maniac. There were basically 0 ways to interact with a card that said, you play it, you pass the turn, you win. So, and just because you don't actually have an instance in this game, right, where you can hold up mana and respond, you have to prep your traps and hope that they go off in the right order. Like with Rel, you can just have a lot of spot removal, have incidental life gain, have blockers early, right? There are ways that you can tune your deck to beat this, and I think that's why, if you're gonna nerf, let's talk about buffs and nerfs here too. If you're gonna nerf Rel, I think it makes sense maybe to push Spark of Genius to 1. I think that does make their draws a little bit more awkward, where they can't guaranteed go off, with a Mizium or a Thing in the Ice on turn 2 or 3. Still, if you have 1 mana, and another cheap spell, you're going to be able to go off. But it does make things a little more awkward. And I think it's cheap spells is where the power lies for Ral, besides Thing in the Ice, right? I mean, maybe bumping this down a toughness or a power could seem reasonable. I think Magnum Opus is pretty fair card. I mean, it used to cost 4 mana, and this deck was not S tier. So I guess if you really wanted to get Ral out of those top spots, you would make Magnum Opus cost 4. I don't really recommend reverting that change. I think, the 3 and 4 cost spells are not what makes Ral necessarily as powerful. I think it's the cheaper spells. So, maybe hitting Spark of Genius could be a good thing. And I think if Ral does get nerfed, I think it makes some of the aggro decks a little bit better. I think the deck might need to change in its construction, maybe start running Pyroclasm, stuff like that. We'll see. We'll see what nerfs could come. I don't think you need to buff this deck, certainly. So, yeah, just moving right along. Let's talk about Teferi for a second. Posted this list by Lukester last time. I think, I have another teammate, Boss MTG, who's working on other builds. I think something that's cool about the meta that's changed a little bit is Pixie Trickster seems to have gone up in the blue decks, just to deal with certain threats. I really think that that's a cool meta shift. I know some people are not running Second Son's Dawn. I think it's close. I think Teferi, is really what keeps, I would say, both Ral and Domri in check. I think it also has good game, or like I would say reasonable game against Liliana. And so I think, kind of how things trend is like as aggro gets better, Teferi gets better, right? And as aggro gets worse, Teferi gets a little worse. Because Teferi is just one of the best ways to deal with aggro. I still think he's really good into mid-range as long as you're kind of playing the games out well. As a Domri player, having played into Teferi, it is a really, really challenging matchup. It's winnable from the Domri side, but it's definitely not favorable. I don't think we need to touch Teferi at all in terms of buffs or nerfs. I think He's a perfectly fair planeswalker that does what he beats the decks he's supposed to be beating, and he loses to the decks that he's kind of supposed to lose to, which can be like Jayce control variants. It can be into like maybe Vraska mid range because Vraska has so much card advantage. But he's beating up on the aggro decks or checking them, and he's checking some of these more aggressive, strategies, which I think is kind of what he's supposed to do by design. I've seen some Teferi builds running different lands in Sacred Sanctum. I still think this is the best land, especially in a meta where you're playing against Rao. Any incidental life gain is really important. So I think, this is just a pretty reasonable planeswalker to be playing when you're trying to consider both Domri and Rao as being S tier. And I think if you're not considering those decks when you're deck building right now and you're playing ranked, it's going to be hard. So you might want to make some of those concessions. And the last deck I want to talk about before we kind of go into the other tiers and keep plugging on through. So these 4 decks, so Domri, Rao, Teferi, and Liliana, I think we can all kind of consider S tier. Liliana, to me, as a strategy, is a little more toxic than Rao, just because it's a combo that can come down on turn 3 or 4 and win you the game, whereas Rao, although can do a lot of crazy stuff in the early game, doesn't just outright win the game, right? The fact that you could, go turn 2 Corpse Conveyor if you have a mana gem, into turn 3, zombify Soul Sever Lich, right? And then give it Silent Strike so you can't block it, right? And it's a 1-turn kill. This to me, I like having decks like this in the format because, so Domri, right? I think Domri would be a lot better if Liliana would not be in the format, because I think Liliana just beats up on Domri super hard because Domri doesn't have, bounce spells or other efficient spells to deal with stuff like Soul Sever Lich. Doesn't have traps to stop them from attacking, right? Or like deal with them when they attack. So I think Liliana is healthy for the format in the sense that combo decks like this can check some of the more consistent like strategies that ramp up, right? Because Domri is more of like kind of a mid-range ramp deck, although it can be aggressive. So I think Liliana is in like a fair place. I think if you were going to nerf her, maybe nerfing Soul Severed Lich in some sort of way, I think is reasonable. Maybe you could even hit Zombify and make it cost 1 more. That could be reasonable. I don't think you need to buff anything about her. I think she is... people have gotten this build to be consistent enough that it's in higher tiers of ranked. Anticipate and Unsummon, Divination, and Grimgrin are all really good additions to this strategy. And I think this, builds similar to this, have really made the deck a lot more consistent. You can still have really terrible draws with the deck. I think that is kind of the downside, is that it is a combo deck. But to me, this strategy, because it's harder to interact with, feels worse when you play against it, right? Like, if I can interact with Ral, but Ral beats me, okay, it kind of sucks that I lost that game, but, like, I was able to grudge match something, I was able to, find something else, or pressure their life total somehow. If they're dropping a turn 3 Lich on you, unless you're playing a blue deck, I don't know how you're dealing with that, right? Besides, I guess, Serra's signature removal card, which is 3 mana, something can't attack. Yeah, so those are kind of my thoughts on Liliana. I haven't actually played this deck because I'm still missing a couple cards, but I am hoping to get it on the channel because it does seem really fun. Like, the play style is very different from other decks, and I think that's, kind of a nice note about the Planeswalker. So I'm going to just transition over here to our neat little tier list, borrowing from Logan Thorne, who I think had something similar on their channel, a little while ago. And this is kind of how I have felt. And I'm sure other players, even on my team, would probably say different things. But in my experience, I don't see enough Teferi and enough Liliana for me to stop playing Domri. I think if both of these decks, if either of these get buffed and Domri stays the same, Domri probably goes down. But for now, I just feel like Domri has such a good win percentage across like most, if not all, aggro decks and most, if not all, mid-range strategies, and even into some of the control strategies if you know how to play around traps. I think that he is just the deck that I like. And I think Rel is obviously still really competitive and actually has a pretty good game into Liliana. And I think if you are playing, if you're an experienced player against Teferi, you can beat Teferi, although I think Teferi is favored against both of these decks. So one thing I'll just say off the bat, if basically nothing changes to Domri or Ral, and like Teferi potentially gets buffed, or like Domri and Ral get nerfed, I think Teferi goes up, because Teferi's already got a good game against those two decks. Like one player I would look out for is Teferi to be a really good deck, post whatever season next patch. If Liliana gets nerfed, she probably will get knocked down quite a bit, just because the deck already kind of struggles with consistency issues. It has an excellent game against Domri. It's 20-30% Domri, I would say. I think Ral has ways to interact with Liliana, so I think it's still favorite Ral. And Teferi and Liliana, I haven't really seen these matchups that much. I haven't played them myself. I would kind of guess that it's a bit 50-50 depending on how the traps play out. So I still think if you're trying to make that last, climb here as the ranked season closes out, I think any of these four decks, very reasonable picks. And I'll say some of the A-tier decks are reasonable picks too. I just think that generally these decks have some of the best game across the field, right? Like, you're not... I'm still... Like, I played into, 5 Angrath decks the other day as Domri. Played into Liliana, Nissa, Kaya. You don't want to just bank on, if I'm only playing against these 4 decks, I'm going to choose Domri, right? You're playing against a mixture of decks, and you want to be playing a deck that just has a good game against most of the field. There are going to be losing matchups. You kind of have to accept that. I talked about that with Domri, right? Like, both Teferi and Liliana are kind of losing matchups for Domri. But I think Domri's favored against Ral, and I think Domri's favored against most of the field. So I've kind of elected to live with that, so to speak. So let's move on. And I appreciate people sticking with the video, because I really just want to do kind of a deep dive today. Nissa. Now, a lot of my teammates on MTG SS, I think, are kind of diehard Nissa people, and I trust their judgment that Nissa is better than she's been getting credit for. Back before Liliana was on the block with her combo, Nissa was the one with the one-turn kill, right? So, and I think people have found ways of optimizing her to not lose to aggro and to be able to out card advantage mid-range. Like, I'll say when I've played Domri into Nissa builds, although a lot of them have varied, the one theme is that the deck gets to play like a mid-range deck, but also with Day of Judgment without punishment. Because you can either opt to wipe the board, and I'm always kind of considering that as a Domri player, or you can try and match me on board position and make me commit to the board more. And just being able to kind of have that modality, right, is just really great as a deck. And I think Nissa is a really viable option still. And for those who got to play the recent event, I was going to put up a video, but unfortunately I didn't have time. Nissa was great for the double mana, double card draw event. So next time that swings around, I would definitely recommend her. So let me just throw up I think just the OG Nissa build that I have, which is this is, I think, kind of the regular one-turn kill, right? Strahd, make their life total 10, give them haste, make sure it can attack through. Vine Snare Hunter makes them lose flying, so you play this before you play Strahd. Bunch of ways to deal with, small ground creatures, and then ways to just get card advantage, right? This is kind of the average list. And I still think it's got a lot of play to it. I think there are other builds too that can be even stronger. We definitely saw a lot of variation. And the deck is really fun to play. I played it in the event. That was the first time I've really played it. Obviously, that was more fun because it's kind of suited for that. But I still think that it's got a lot of game into the current ladder. So I think if any of the S tier strategies are nerfed from these guys, I think Nissa has a real shot of making it up here. Um, I think kind of the same goes for Serra. And Serra, I'll just put this deck list up while we're talking. Um, Serra, from what I can tell, people tend to go towards more of an aggro variant, right? Oath of the Paladin. This is just something I cooked up. I don't necessarily think this is the best list. Um, but I think the problem with aggro Serra, even with Moorland Haunt, and you can have these like powerful legendaries to bring back, um, to me it just doesn't do enough into Ral or into Domri. And I think you just have to consider those decks when you're deck building, at least right now. And I think although, yes, like Serra's ability, right, to heal your creatures means that you should be like trading and fighting and all of that. I just don't think it's enough. I just don't think you have enough card advantage or enough aggression to really get there. That's just my opinion about aggro Serra builds. This is, I think a mid range build, something like this, is more what I feel could be like an S tier strategy in the future. I think the combination of Gold Knight Harbinger, doubling or quadrupling power in your deck with Panharmonicon into an Achroma is a good way to finish the game. You're white, so you have access to Vindictive Shot. You've got access to Immolating Glare, Path to Exile, right? Day of Judgment. These are all ways to deal with mid range and to deal with decks like Ral, right? And you've got access to a bunch of ways to gain life. I've gotten up to 40, 50 life with this deck, no problem. Meanwhile, you're stalling the ground, and then you just play a big legendary, and close out the game. Moorland Haunt still has a lot of really good targets in this deck, so I still think that that's probably the best land for her. Yeah, I mean, I'm just a big proponent of, if you're going to play Serra, I think you want to go more mid range. I think you kind of have to, because I think aggro just doesn't have enough gas and doesn't have enough aggression to necessarily get there. Now, in some matchups, I'm sure that's true, but I think across the field, going more mid range, you will probably find more success with Serra. But like I said, so I think, if any of these kind of get nerfed potentially, I think Serra definitely has some decent game. Serra into Ral, I think it's a good matchup for Serra. Serra into Domri, if it's more mid range, I think could have a good matchup. Serra into Teferi, it's a little harder, but I think potentially winnable. And I think Serra to Liliana is very good because you've got, well, I shouldn't say very good. I should say I think it's favored because you have a lot of the white traps that can interact. You've got a ton of life gain. I think you've got a little bit more way to deal with this deck. So, if Ral gets nerfed, I think Serra's already good into that, but like maybe Domri gets nerfed or Teferi potentially, which I don't think will happen. I think Ral and Liliana are kind of the biggest targets. Serra could move up for sure. I think now from here things get a little harder. Also, sorry, Karn is going to be our Drizzt, just because we don't have Drizzt as a planeswalker up here. I think I would like to talk about Ajani. I think Ajani is, aside from Drizzt, the other kind of mid-rangey, aggro-y option that has decent game. I think Ajani can beat Domri, although I still feel like Domri being able to top out at these huge 8-drops that just are highly impactful and really hard to disrupt in the early game unless you're playing a lot of removal. I think that Domri's still a little bit favored against Ajani, although I think the matchup's somewhat close. I think Ajani also has pretty good game into Ral when it gets, the kind of the right removal. And I think Ajani has, decent game in certain ways against Teferi potentially. I do think Ajani struggles the same reason that Domri does against Liliana. You know, it just like you can't really deal with like the turn one kill kind of scenarios as well. But I still think he's really, I mean, he beats up on all the aggro decks, right? That makes him good. And he can beat out some of the mid range matchups as well. So I think that also makes him good. He's probably going to lose to control most of the time, or potentially combo. Um, like, you know, Nissa will just go over the top of Ajani, you know, pretty easily. I think Serra has the same potential. So I think putting him here is reasonable. I think Vivien deserves to be in the discussion. I've really struggled with this deck. I've been playing with one of my teammates' versions of the deck, Boss MTG. I think he's a huge fan of Vivien. I think she does have a lot of modality to her. I think she is a pretty hard deck to pilot, actually, contrary to when I first started the game. Um, I think there are ways to build her because of the way her deck building works. So let's flip over to her real quick. Um, you know, this is like a current version that I'm trying out. You know, my teammates made some changes, I think, by now, but you know, it's really cool that you can play. You know, it's like I think it's 8 different multicolored cards. So there's just a lot of modality to it. So I think Vivien, as a sort of aggro mid range deck, deserves to be in the discussion in the upper tier. Um, I think it really depends on how you're deck building. Like if you're deck building to beat Domri and Ral, she can be really good, and I think she has game against Teferi, and she also I think has pretty decent game against Liliana. So I think Vivien definitely could move up potentially over Ajani, honestly. Um, so I think that they're kind of close. The two other mid range decks I would want to talk about are Drizzt and Vraska. If you've seen some of my older videos, I've been like kind of a pretty big Drizzt fan. I know back in the day this deck was super toxic. I think it's much more not toxic now, but that's just how I feel. I actually haven't played this too much on the ladder as of recently because I do think it's kind of strictly worse than playing a deck like Domri. Um, but I do think that it's one of the only like aggro decks to me that scales really well. Like you can play these one drops, right? Like Malice and Peer that pressure your opponent early. Same with Zinderspilt, which is a card who was testing Yanogu. Um, then you've got card advantage. You've got like the best deck for Tarmogoyf. And then you've got, you know, access to, you know, some other interesting cards to kind of close out the game. And things scale up because you're always just pumping up your passive Guinevere. Right. So I would say if you've wanted to play mid range, maybe don't have the cards for Domri or don't want to play Domri. Um, Same goes for Ajani. I think Drizzt has some really cool play patterns, and I really really recommend the Traveler Supply. Um, just build. I think you can run Alarm Bell as well. I think that is something I was kind of toying with. This is kind of a build that I ended up on fairly recently, but again, this is a deck that you can really play with and tune, you know, to beat other decks. So I think it's worth, you know, mentioning Drizzt here. Um, and then Vraska, you know, I haven't seen a ton of Vraska, but I think she is due for a bit of a comeback. I think this is the build that I played with most recently on the channel. I'm sure there are changes you could make, but I think some of the standout cards are like Steed, which just is really backbreaking when you sacrifice this on your turn. I think that Grudge Match is still obviously really good. Tarmogoyf is good in the deck. Grotesque can set up some really nasty draws for you. And Turn to Stone is probably just the best removal spell, you in the game. You've got Woodland Hermitage to keep, you know, your card advantage going, and obviously Koth is just kind of a good placeholder, a good legendary. You could even skew her more mid-range, you know, play Ebon Death and like some of these other cards. But the thing that she does really well, I think, is she beats up on aggro really well. Right, and you'll notice there are not a lot of aggro decks up here yet, and I think that's just because we're living in a mid-range world. Um, do I see plenty of aggro decks on the ladder? Absolutely, and I think there are some aggro strategies we'll get up here pretty soon. But I still think that Vraska is able to deal with a lot of the mid-range decks. I think Vraska into Domri is pretty tough. I think Vraska into Ral is pretty tough. Vraska, I think, also has good game into Teferi. So like, I want everyone who's kind of tuning in here just to be thinking about, all right, if I see some nerfs here or some potential buffs, in this tier, who knows? Maybe some of these planeswalkers move up. I think they are pretty close in power level. I have seen like 0 Vraska on the ladder, but I think that basically since I've been in Mythic. But I think if any of the top tier strategies go down even a little bit, I think that she has the potential. She always has the potential to be really good at interacting with the board and really good at disrupting your opponent with some of the finale creatures that you have. So I think these are the mid-range menaces, so to speak, and I would put them roughly in this order. Like I would probably personally put Drizzt, who's our little card token, ahead of Ajani. I just have kind of Ajani was helpful for me to get to Mythic when I was playing against a lot of other aggro and mid-range, but I have not found it to be that good into the top tier decks. And I think Drizzt actually does have some pretty explosive draws that can really get there. So as best I could, I think this is kind of how I would put some of the beginnings of A tier. I would put Angrath as probably the premier aggro deck to be playing. I will kind of caveat this by saying I think Angrath actually should be more of a mid-range deck where we are now, and on my channel you'll see that I tested this sort of aggro variation. I did add Heat Shimmer because I thought this was a cool piece of tech to give your unblockable creatures, right? Your sneak creatures, you can just copy them and have them attack. So I think that can be really powerful. I think some of the best curves that I'll see is like Silent Prowler into Rage Runner with Sneak into Join the Family. That can be a really, really crippling curve as an aggro deck. And because, the Emberspawn Crags synergize so well with being able to deal direct damage to your opponent via Seared Chains, Shock, or otherwise, you can just... There are some games where, if they just hit one proc of this on turn 6 or 7, you're dead. So I do think that Angrath should be in the discussion as an aggro deck, although I think changing this potentially to the Monastery that gives you a temporary card, I think could be better. Like, I feel like if you want to deal with some of the mid-range strategies, you kind of have to go mid-range yourself, right? Because aggro usually gets beaten out by mid-range usually gets beaten out by control. And if we're living in a mid-range world, you kind of have to be able to tussle with the mid-range decks. And I think you can make Angrath a little bit more modal, where you've got, I think something that I'm not running in this deck is Takedown. I think Takedown is incredibly good right now. I think that Flagrant Foul is also incredibly good right now. So I think those 2 cards should probably be in your Angrath deck. And I think, Monastery is a pretty good addition. So I think, if you've been having, let's say, less than desirable success with Angrath, just playing it standard aggro, I would encourage you to try building it more mid-range and see how it fares. And I'd be surprised if you didn't have a little bit more success with it. So I think we have to talk about him. I mean, I would potentially put Angrath, here-ish. These are the 2 aggro decks in my mind that have... or I guess 3 if you kind of count Vivien, that have some pretty good game. If Angrath gets better, Teferi gets better, right? But if Teferi somehow got worse, Angrath, I think it's a lot better. I think Angrath has a little bit of a harder time into Ral, but has, can beat out Domri as well. So I didn't want to just cut out Mr. Angrath because I think he has some good game. Let's see. I have to think about where we want to go from here. All right, let's talk about Jayce. And I think Jayce is maybe somewhere in here. Now, I'm not the biggest Jayce player, and that's mainly because the last time I tried Jayce was at the beginning when Lab Maniac was first getting started, and I quickly abandoned it because I hated how toxic the deck was. Now, what I would recommend is just building Jayce as kind of a standard control list. So let's just do this together for a second. And I think the splash is still white. It's probably just Island, actually. I don't know that I would play any of these other lands. I think School of the Wizard's kind of a no-brainer. I think you could do some combination of Constrictors, Runeshell Crab, and then I think, what else might you play? You might play Healer. You could see that. I think Unsummon's pretty reasonable. I only have one Snapcaster, but I think you should probably be playing Snapcaster. Isochron, I think, is a pretty easy no-brainer. Anticipate. You could even potentially play Snapshell Turtle if you want to run more traps. I think Lore Keeper is a pretty early, reasonable early drop. What else would I recommend? Potentially Path to Exile, maybe one or two. Figments are kind of an easy card to jam in there. Divination, obviously. What else would I put in here? Shell Game, pretty good removal spell right now. I'd probably play at least one Trickster, maybe two. So I think this card has gone up to deal with the variety of really important threats that you need to have answers to. Yeah, I think I probably would play on Summon, actually. I think you play all your signature cards. Wow, so we're already filled up. So might have to tweak this a little bit. Okay. So yeah, I'll probably switch some of these around. Because how do you want to end the game? Yeah, Mist Raven's also an interesting answer. I mean, you should be playing 2 Day of Judgment. I think you probably need to be playing Second Sun's Dawn. It's just such a good way to end the game. So maybe you cut something like... Oh, why no? Maybe you don't need Mana Constrictor, let's say. Just go big with Second Sun's Dawn. I think you definitely want to play Arcanus. Okay. Just in making this in literally 5 seconds, this is probably a fine build. I think School of the Wizard is really important. If you don't have this card for Jayce, I think it's going to be a little hard for you. But and I'm sure you could tweak some of this, or go look at some of the other content creators who are making Jayce decks. I just have not put a lot of time into it. But I think you don't build them with Lab Maniac. I just don't think that's actually that good anymore. And I think you just kind of build them control with Wizard class, and you're just, wiping the board, you're bouncing their creatures, you're getting closer to your passive, you've got card advantage with Arcanus and Second Sun, you've got answers with Shell Game, Pixie Trickster, you've got defensive options, you've got card advantage, you've got Snapcaster Mage, and I think, something like this would be fine. So, and I think, when we think about the tier list, Jayce has good game into a lot of the mid-range options. I still, it's hard for me to put him that high up because I just haven't played that many games with Jayce. And I'll say playing Domri or Ral into Jayce has felt fine. So I just, I don't know if Jayce is the best person to answer these decks. I think Teferi as a control deck is, and that's why Teferi's up here. But, if some of these guys get nerfed, Jayce could be up there, right? So I think he's worth talking about. Now, I think the last mid-range deck we have here is Kiora. I'm gonna put her in B tier. So I am a big fan of one of the lists. I think I have their name. Yes, Narash, who's I think a streamer, a streamer, yeah. And they built this really cool like aggro Kiora list, and I played around with it in Mythic, and it actually felt pretty good. I'm sure you could go back in here, tune the list, add other interactive blue and green spells um, that shore up your matches against some of the top tier decks. But this honestly felt really good. Like that Kiora list felt really good into both of these, or felt like pretty decent. Felt like a reasonable matchup. But I do think that Kiora could use some love. I'm not sure what it is. I don't know if it's like necessarily like her signature cards potentially. Um, when I look at like Dragoner can be a really good removal spell. Sometimes you get kind of unlucky with it. Tide Shaper is good. I wouldn't necessarily want to buff it to be like a 2-mana 2/2 that does this, but honestly, I think that would make the deck a little bit more competitive. Octopummeler, I think, is just not a card, like, at least in this meta, that you can be playing. So I think she could use some help if you want her to be more of a mid-range threat. Maybe there are other builds out there. Not a big Kiora player myself. I think if you're going to start with something, I would actually start with this build because I think it's got some really interesting modality. Also, sorry, I didn't have 2 Ether Figments when I was building this, so I think what did I? Yeah, cut blindside, add Figment. I think this is a reasonable build to be playing, and I think I have it in some of my previous videos because I'm not going to post all the deck codes to every deck we're going over today, but of course you can just pause the video and look at the list. So I think Kiora is just probably the weakest mid-range deck, in my opinion. So I think that's why we would put her in B tier, and then Ashiok I think kind of is the outlier as like the worst deck right now. Although maybe there are better constructions of the deck that we haven't really seen. And as you can see, we've got 5 aggro decks sitting here that we haven't touched yet. So doesn't mean aggro's dead. No. As I said before, I think Drizzt and Angrath have pretty good aggro options, but just with the way the meta has shaped, mid-range, like having card advantage, having late-game capability, having removal, having good creatures that are like potent threats, that's not really what aggro does, right? Aggro is all about being cheap, being efficient, being sort of tempo-oriented, and I just think that's mid-range has a lot of really good options right now. And I think if you're like, man, I'm an aggro player through and through, which, to be honest, that's me in Magic the Gathering. Domri plays kind of like an aggro deck that just scales up. So I would recommend that. But also, I think give yourself a shot at Vivien or Drizzt or Angrath. If you're really concerned with climbing and being successful, I think that those are kind of the premier aggro strategies. Now, I personally, let's just get into Kaya. I personally really like Kaya. And the reason being is that she's an aggro deck that inherently has card advantage, right? Because of the way her passive works, where when you complete a mission, you have the chance to gain any of these spirits. And I'll tell you, some of the most back-breaking curves in this deck is being able to go some sort of 1-drop, either invoke the Dawn It or play another 1-drop, or usually the best draw. I should probably just talk about the best draw. The best draw is playing a 1-drop into Vengeful Brute, which will guarantee you the 3 damage so that you get your first creature. And if your first creature is the Stalwart Spirit, which debut, you stun an enemy creature, your opponent's going to be behind no matter what. And if they don't have some really cheap answers or ways to wipe the board early, this deck can just run away with the game. And I think it's the best deck to use Hellmouth Cave. Maybe it should be playing a land that's a bit more mid-range. Maybe the deck should be more mid-range. But to be honest, I would play this deck in Mythic. I think it does have some decent game against decks that are not really hyper concerned with aggro. This thing can get really crazy. Um, Angrath, I think, obviously has a lot of potential, and that's why I would put it above, just because I think it's consistently a little bit better into the mid range field. But if decks are really disrespecting aggro, I think Kaya has a lot of potential. And also, what's great about this deck, it's super cheap. So if you don't have, if you're going free to play like me, I just play the game a lot. So that's why I have a lot of cards. You can build this deck. It's got Thalia, it's got Scathing Claire, it's got Glorious Anthem's not a card, and Stoneforge Mystic. Right, so that's it. Plus your land, of course. And some of the best play patterns are you get a cut down in your hand and you just use it to continue completing your missions and getting it back. And if you ever have 2 cut downs, the deck feels like kind of unfair because you're just getting all this free card advantage and refilling your board with more spirits. I have a Kaya video up on the channel, so if you're interested in the deck, feel free to check it out. So personally, I just really like Kaya as an aggro deck. I don't think it's as strong as Angrath, but I think she could get some love by having any of these kind of strategies nerfed a bit. I think another aggro strategy we should talk about is Chandra. It's been a long time since I played Chandra, but I do think playing Chandra with like red-black could be cool, and this is actually a build that I reverse engineered from a person that I played against. And as you can see, they're playing kind of my favorite mid-range red land, which is Molten Monastery. So you'll see some one-drops, but you'll also see stuff like Opening Salvo, and you'll see Counterfeiter. Even Pyrobot, I know, seems kind of questionable, but what this deck is doing is it's still able to pressure your opponent early, but it's playing like cheap removal alongside some other creatures that are, have sneak. Pyrobot, it's just a 4/1 that gets you another card, right? Ball of Lightning for damage, Zozu, Looting Lizard for card advantage. I think probably you play one more Flame Shot and just take out this Cage Match, actually. This was a card I tested a little bit. And then obviously Lava Axe, because they're starting with 4 damage on their life total. This deck, I think, I don't know. I mean, I played against it as Domri and I lost because it just out-card advantaged me. Like, I had to trade and deal with their early creatures, and they got, like, extra cards off of Pyrobot and Firecrafter, used Flame Shots advantageously, even though I was playing around them. Looting Lizard at some point in the game to draw 3 cards when they only had 1 in their hand. And then they got like 2 or 3 free cards off of Monastery. And to be honest, when you're getting raced by a Chandra and you're sitting at like 10 life, you do not want your Chandra opponents drawing extra cards. It's terrifying because they're going to have 2 Lava Axes in their deck if you're at 10 life. So giving them even more extra chances to hit other impactful spells was, in my mind, what made the difference in the matchup. They're also running black for Takedown, right? Counterfeiter and Rage Runner. I think these are great options for this kind of build. So if you're a Chandra stan and you've been kind of struggling, I would give this build a shot. I really felt like it was pretty good when I was playing Domri. So that's kind of my 2 cents on Chandra. She's the beginning of Planeswalker. People usually move off of her because of that reason. I can understand the dev team probably doesn't want to buff her too much necessarily, just because like she can really burn opponents out. But these 2 aggro strategies definitely are struggling in the current meta, in my opinion. So we'll kind of see where they go. And I think we can kind of put all of these up here. I'll kind of put these in the order that I've personally liked them. I think Sorin still can curve out really well. I think you do want to build Sorin with white. That's kind of been my sneaking suspicion for a while, just because although red does give you, we'll go over red real quick, you can play Shock. Sinister Host obviously cheapens cards. I think that is good. Takedown, Falconroth, Duchess, which allows you to go wide. I think this is a viable build. You can play Pact of the Warlock. I think it's probably pretty decent in the build. You will get wins with this deck. You can climb with this deck. But I think into the best decks, it's still a couple steps behind. And what I would recommend, and what I would want to highlight here if you're going to go white, which I think could be better for the current meta. I know some people play Westvale Abbey. I'm still kind of on maybe Hellmouth or Old Graveyard personally. We're going to play all these. I think the tools that you get potentially in like Invoke of the Dawn, making your draws a little better, potentially shields up. But I think the main one is the 4-drop white vampire with armor. Also, Redeemed Thief, I think, is a reasonable card. Where is... Do I not have it? Okay. Anyway, I won't spend too much time on this, but I think the reason you want to play white is I do think Oath of the Paladin is helpful in the sense of you get an early drop, doesn't really matter. I mean, sometimes the toughness on like a creature, like a vampire that drains can be really good. Divine Smite, still just like, fine removal spell. But Aura of Courage, like pumping your vampires that can already get pumped if your opponent is below that life total, with Sorin's passive, right? If they're at 10 health or less, giving attacking creatures +1/+0. So if you have Aura of Courage, they're getting +2/+1, which is massive, for your team. So I think I could have sworn that vampire cost 4. I don't know where. Maybe it costs 5. Oh, there he is. Vampiric Knight. This thing looks really innocuous, right? It's a 2/4 for 4, bad rate. It's got armor. Okay, it drains them for 2. This thing just gets like minimum. Oh, we've got a cat incoming real quick. Yes, thank you. Minimum gonna drain your opponent for 6 if you count Sorin's passive, right? Which automatically drains 1, which is a pretty huge life swing. And just imagine getting this thing buffed or having other combat tricks. It's doing a lot of work. So, we've had talk on the team of like, let's say Vampiric Knight goes down to 3 mana. That could definitely take this deck a little higher. I think Virtus is a cool, card to be playing in the deck as well. You've got access to Flagrant Foul. You can play Stromkirk Mentor to give your guys sneak. I think Sorin is just a couple steps away from being more a viable aggro deck. And personally, I really liked playing with this deck on release, but it just wasn't the best thing to be doing. So it'd be great if Sorin could get some love. And let's see if we can close this out soon. It's been a long video. I appreciate anyone who's sticking through it. And I enjoy kind of doing these deep dives because it also helps me learn the game better because I also have my like pet decks that I like playing. It's good for me to be talking about, what other decks could be options. So Nahiri, I actually really liked early on in the meta when it was not quote unquote solved, because I felt like having flyers was really good. I thought Gutfire Devil, making use of her sword, right, which gets +2/+0 because it was buffed. That means, okay, this used to be a 1/1. That meant that they had to like take 3 damage from your Gutfire Devil instead of blocking it. So like I felt like she had the best way of using Gutfire Devil in an aggro sense. And then I really liked Active Volcano. I would, if you're playing Nahiri now, you could build this kind of like burn sort of Gutfire strategy, but I think also you should probably just playing Monastery, the red Monastery that gives you a temporary card. I think you probably just get so much card advantage out of that. Like Nahiri's always been kind of, I feel, strictly worse than Kaya, because I think Kaya kind of does a similar thing, but a bit more efficiently, and her passive is just so much more powerful. Like, giving a card +2/+0, like, sure, that's fine for an aggro deck. getting a free creature that then has an effect every turn just by attacking is, I think, better than having to pay 1 mana to give a creature +2/+0. So I just think that Kaya has a bit of a leg up. But I do think that, Nahiri has some game in certain metas. Something I was trying was like a Gutfire control build with her. Just getting your devils, doing a lot of direct damage, then wiping the board with Day of Judgment to guarantee that you kill your devils, heat shimmering, copping your devils. This was just like kind of a build that I saw some people playing with like right when Gutfire had come out and thought was interesting. But I think it's a little too cute. I don't think it's consistent enough to be a real player. But I don't know, if you have fun with it, which I definitely did have fun with this deck, I could recommend it. Who else we got? Right, Gideon. So I guess I would probably, if I'm really looking at this realistically, I'd probably put these 3 as like the best of the B tier sort of aggro strategies. They could even be higher than Kiora necessarily. It's hard for me to gauge Kiora, so I think let's put Kiora maybe down here. I think Kaya is I feel the best aggro deck of this tier. But if we look at Gideon, right? Gideon did get nerfed. I think Gideon was pretty powerful. Why do I feel like I can't see Gideon? Is it doing that thing where yeah, okay. Okay. So Gideon, Fair Fight, I think, is still a pretty reasonable strategy. I think Negate is like a sweet card to have in decks like this. We've got Oath of the Paladin obviously doing a lot of work. Still got Paragon of Balance that can do a lot of work, but also Spawning Arowana got nerfed to be essentially a 2/2. What do you have to say? Do you have to be the center of attention always? She's like, hey, this video is really too long. Why are you doing this? Taking it very personally, BB. Okay. I still think this is a cool build. I think there are some numbers you could probably change around. And I think, when this deck curves out, I think it's still a really good option. And the modality of having stuff like Negate and Paragon, which your opponents aren't always really considering, and sometimes having explosive Fair Fight matchups, and Geist, I think, is a cool addition. Another card I would definitely think about if you're playing this strategy is, oh goodness, where is he? The Dungeon Geist. Dungeon Geist, I think, I didn't have that until recently. This card's kind of perfect for this strategy, right? It's a 2/2 body that flies, stuns something as long as it's alive. The reason I think Gideon is just not that good of a strategy is that when you're playing into a mid-range meta, I think he just really struggles. When he's playing into a control meta, he's great. But I think when you're dealing with decks that have really good removal options like Ral, and playing into Domri, who is just going to play like essentially better creatures than you early, is how I feel. Like sometimes you have a 1-mana 3/3, sometimes you have a Gatstaff Shepherd that turns into a 4/4 that gains you 2 life and makes a 1/1. Like, what is Gideon doing into those matchups? The answer is like, I don't think a lot. But Bucksfu, if you see this, please, I'm not hating on your boy. I know you're a big Gideon fan. So who knows? Maybe he could use the buff back to being having a 4/4 as the passive. Maybe Arowana even being a 3/3 again instead of a 2/2 could make this deck a bit more competitive. I'm not really sure in a mid-range meta what it's going to take for Gideon to be back on top. I think it's going to be tough for him to get there. But I still think it is a powerful deck into other aggro strategies and into control strategies. So if you're seeing a lot of aggro and control, like this is what I think is a little aside here. I think this is what's really cool about Spellslingers is I always like things that have a metagame because you can always try and outthink the meta, right? And the meta also doesn't matter. Like, if you're not seeing any of these 4 decks, play whatever you want, right? Because you just want to think about, okay, what am I seeing? Oh, I'm seeing a lot of Angrath. Okay, let me play a mid-range deck, or let me play Teferi. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of Liliana. Okay, let me play a control deck that can interact or like bounce their creatures, right? Oh, I'm seeing a ton of Chandra. Okay, let me play Serra so I can gain life, or let me play, you know, mid-range deck like Vivien, which will have big creatures to stop them from attacking me. You know, I think the fun of this, whether you're trying to climb up a ranked, whether you just love deck building, is you can always just say, you know, what do I think has the best chance against what are the decks that I'm seeing. So the tier list doesn't really matter so much as it's just we're just talking about specific matchups, right? And so as long as you're considering what matchups you're seeing, then you're probably doing the right thing when it comes to deck building. And also, there are plenty of fun decks to play that are like semi-competitive. That over time you'll probably get to Mythic with, and who cares? So I think, I want this channel to kind of be both educational and kind of focused towards ranking up, but I also don't want to just completely exclude the players who are like they're not super interested in what the quote meta decks are, but hopefully, just by discussing some of these builds, it feels like, okay, there's some wiggle room. Okay, maybe I tune my Ashiok deck, to do something else. I think I'll close out the video. I mean, do I even have an Ashiok build? It's been so long since I've played Ashiok. And I also was a part of the Ashiok meta when this deck was just so toxic. So, haven't been the biggest on it. I guess this is maybe a place you could start. I actually thought Mana Short was a cute card into the Domri decks because they're trying to keep their mana open for Moonlight. So I thought that was kind of cool as a trap. I think Ashiok still has a pretty good game into aggro. And Ashiok I think can also be kind of good into control, right? And sometimes against Ral specifically was good because you're putting all these nightmares in their deck and they're trying to draw extra cards to play extra spells. So, again, I think it's really matchup dependent. Some of these decks can really move the needle, a little bit further up or further down, just depending on what matchups you're seeing. So don't quote me on this build. I don't know that this is the best Ashiok build to be playing. I do think Ashiok needs some love. Maybe reverting the passive back to the top 10 cards instead of the top 15 could be better. Maybe we make Shadow Stag a 3-mana 3/5 so it comes down earlier. I'm not really sure what it's going to take to make Ashiok. I think Ashiok can match Ral. I think it would probably struggle with Teferi and Liliana to some degree. And I think it can beat Domri, but I don't know. It would need a lot of help. I think you'd have to play like both Unsummons, both Flagrant Fells, definitely the Infests. You'd have to load up on a lot of spot removal to have a shot. But who knows? For any of you Ashiok fans out there, it would be interesting to see this deck kind of back in the meta, but personally, I find just between all the animations with the nightmares and everything else, like, I'm just not a huge fan of this deck. But I'm sure some people really like this sort of blue-black control sort of, vibe, and so I'm not going to rain on their parade. I do think that Ashiok needs some help to even come close to really competing with the A-tier decks, let alone some of these matchups, but wow, I think that's everything. So, I just appreciate with y'all sticking with the video. Wish you the best on your ranked climbs or just if you're having fun with the game. Please feel free to comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you think my little tier list here is just crazy wrong. And I just appreciate all the feedback, all the support, and looking forward to a new season. And I'll catch you then.